We're live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I am super excited that all of you are tuning in. And if you're watching this as a replay, thanks for watching. My name is Jasmine. I have a YouTube channel. We do witch stuff over here. You already know. But I have a special guest with me today. So introduce yourself I don't know how someone wouldn't know you, but if they don't.
Well, hello everyone. Hello, I'm Kelden. I do witchy stuff too, and I write books. I've written 2 books, The Crooked Path, an introduction to traditional witchcraft, and the new book, The Witch's Sabbath, an exploration of history, folklore, and modern practice. I also have a YouTube channel, and I've been told that that's tagged, so people can click on that. You can also find me on Instagram at Kelden Mercury.
Yes. So check out the links. Kelden's YouTube is linked in this video, and any other links I will make sure are tagged after this stream has gone. So I messaged Kelden because at the shop, we have this book club that we call the Indie Witches Book Club. Indie, as in short for Indianapolis. That's our nickname for the city. And we have this book club. So every other month, we get together for a physical meetup. And then the opposite month, we have an online meetup. And books are chosen by the store. So I have a hand in that part. But then we let the members of the community select what book we are going to have for the book club. And this past go around, we had Backwoods Witchcraft, Traditional Witchcraft, and Blood and Bones as our book selection, which I really liked all 3 of these books. So I ordered all of them and I read all of them. And I really, really, really was touched, Kelden, not to sound dramatic, but it's been a while since I've read. And not that I think that I'm a super well-read witch by any means, but I read. We be reading over here. We do. We read. And it's not every book. It's you can get things. I think you can get things from any book, to be fair. But not every book really, this book really, really spoke to me. And I made a whole video about kind of my personal thoughts about Kelden's book, Traditional Witchcraft. So I'm not going to go into too much detail unless it comes up in conversation about my thoughts about Kelden's book in this video. So after this stream, if you want to know more about kind of my rants and ramblings about it, I think it's Traditional Witchcraft book review, Crooked Path, the time I made a blood pact with the devil, something cute like that. You can find it. But why don't will you first kind of define for people who might be listening right now who haven't read the book, what exactly is traditional witchcraft? I guess we should start there.
Yeah. Well, that's always sort of it's typically been the very difficult thing is defining traditional witchcraft, but luckily, over the years, I've come to form my own definition, which really is a big part of the Crooked Path book. But traditional witchcraft is a non-Wiccan form of witchcraft that is highly influenced and inspired by folklore. And there's sort of 3 key elements that, in my opinion, make up traditional witchcraft. The first is working with magic, and typically this is through the use of folk magic. Working with the other world, partnering and making pacts with spirits, engaging in the practice of spirit flight or hedge crossing, attending the witch's sabbath in the other world. And then the third piece is working with the natural landscape. So focusing in on bioregionalism, specifically tuning into the land that you live on, working with the spirits of that land, the genus loci, the land white, so on and so forth. And I think all of those things come together and form a very sort of broad enough definition, but also I think narrowed in enough that we can start to understand what exactly traditional witchcraft is.
Yeah, and I feel from reading your book, because really your book is, it's funny to me how much of your book is I was almost it was because I also made a video where like, okay, I didn't know the word fetch, right? Like I had no idea that like fetch spirit was even a concept in the craft until I read your book. And Taya, like, because I had done this premiere for this video about like shape shifting and like the time I turned into a serpent and like, not clickbait. And Taya was like, oh, that sounds like fetch spirit. And I was like, what? Huh? What? And so like, that's another thing about your book that I really enjoyed is like reading it. I was like, wow, like some of this is kind of like confirmational in a way to where it's like, this is not necessarily just Jasmine's personal UPG. And it was very validating in that way as well, because when I got to your passage about the fetch spirit, you're
Sorry.
fine. You're fine.
I live near a hospital, so we get a lot of ambulance traffic.
No, you're totally fine. When I got to your part about the fetch spirit, like I'm not necessarily saying that that's been in my practice verbatim, but pretty similar, honestly.
Mhm.
And so it was very like confirmational in the sense that it made me feel like the concept of the mighty dead or the witches who have come before us really do be speaking to and through me. You know what I mean? And not that I necessarily need that confirmation, but it was still nice to have that confirmation to know that like, okay, this is something that other people are also tapping into. And it's not necessarily just UPG. Not that there's anything wrong with UPG, but like
Right.
it's different when you're like, okay, other witches are doing something similar to this too.
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of things that we sort of do intuitively as witches, and maybe things that we've been doing all along and we didn't even realize what it is. And then we read something and it's like we find that there's language and to put to it. And that is a really validating experience.
Yeah,
So
and
I'm
I feel that
sure, I
way.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
I feel that way about the witch's devil too. And that's definitely what I want to spend some time talking about. So like how did you put this into words? Like I think you kind of talked about how this concept of the witch's devil is the Christian devil and is also not the Christian devil at the same time. It's this conglomeration, right? Would you say?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, oh, yes. Now you said the magic words, and now I'm just gonna
Please,
go off.
please.
I This is such a hot topic. I mean, I guess I don't know if it's necessarily as hot as it used to be because I think more and more people are talking about the concept of the devil in witchcraft without sort of that immediate like, oh no, there's no devil in the craft. I think that we've sort of grown to a place where we can have these more nuanced conversations and recognize that people work differently and work with different spirits, and there's room for all of that. But one of the things that I've been particularly fascinated by is the way in which witchcraft really comes out of and grows in response to Christianity. And this is something that a lot of people really, really don't like. They don't want this to be true. They want to have a history of witchcraft that that passes over Christianity, that doesn't have anything to do with it. And like that's just not how that works. Of course, that's not to say that anyone needs to involve any aspects of Christianity in their witchcraft practice today. Nobody has to work with the devil, so on and so forth, all of those sort of caveats and whatnot. But the witch's devil comes out of this rich folklore that so much of our other witchcraft folklore, I mean, it's all coming from the same place, from these trial transcripts, from these written records. And part of it is that witches work with the devil. But the question becomes, who is the devil, right? Is this literally the same entity as like Satan? Is this Lucifer? A lot of times those concepts themselves get conflated. And I think they also deserve to be sort of pulled apart and looked at as separate things. Lucifer, Satan, the devil, right? These are not these are not the same. But there's an argument to be made about how when Christianity took hold, any gods, any spirits that were not the Christian God were labeled as devils, as demons. We see this happen, and there's sort of this romantic notion, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily like 100% historical fact, but these beings are sort of handed back to the people and to maybe like accused witches in these narratives, and they just sort of roll with it. And the devil then is this amalgamation of these different spirits, and it's this way that those spirits then survive, that they're preserved. And we see this shift happen, and this is typically where people start to make the distinction between the theological devil and the folkloric devil. And so the theological devil is very much aligned with biblical notions, but the folkloric devil is this character that comes up in popular folk stories. So as time goes on, these folk stories come out, and the devil sometimes plays a role. And the role he plays is often this sort of trickster entity. He's often testing people's sort of moral character. And a lot of times people outwit him. People are sort of smarter. He's, in a lot of stories, he's actually kind of this bumbling person. And in other stories, he's a shaper of the landscape. A good way to see this is, you can go to different landmarks, state parks, national parks, and you'll see sort of geographical formations, and they bear the name, the devil's X, Y, or Z, right?
Yeah.
And the idea is that the devil is shaping the land.
We actually have at a state park not too far from me, it's called Shades State Park. And there's a lot of folklore in the park. One of those parts of the lore is the Devil's Punch Bowl, which is in Shades State Park.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the devil seems to have multiple punch bowls too. Cause like also.
Yes, I was just going to say, the town that I lived in for graduate school had a Devil's Punch Bowl, and it was supposed to be, and I can attest to it because I spent a lot of time there, like a hotbed of spirit activity. And I guess when I was moving there, someone was like, "Oh, you're moving there? Like I heard like there's these witches that meet at the Devil's Punch Bowl at night." And I was like, "Okay, we'll see about that."
Yeah. Well, I was telling you too before we started. So, and I told the people in the live, so we had read Backwoods Witchcraft by Jake Richards. And in his book, he also talks about these devilish places, I guess we'll say. And Jake talks about the Devil's Looking Glass in Tennessee, which is near where he lived. And there's a witch, and I believe it's at the Devil's Looking Glass, but I was joking around with some of the coven witches about, so there's this witch named Ol Ms. Wilson who hangs out, I guess. I'm not sure if she's based off of a real person and then it turned into folklore, or if she was always folklore. I'm really not sure, to be honest. But apparently, like when the moon is full, she like conjures the dead and has a whole party, and like, it's crazy. And I'm like, that's my kind of girl. Like, can we call her up for the seance? Can she come through?
Right.
Like, I'm all about that. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so as traditional witches or folkloric witches, basically just as witches who were inspired by folklore, it makes sense that the devil would be this really potent spirit ally because there's so much rich folklore about him that we can pull from, and that's part of the thing is when we look at that folklore, we're not seeing witches working with different pagan divinities that we would maybe know today, we see them working with the devil. Again, this is not to say that there's anything wrong with working with different pagan deities, because again, it's likely that some of those were pulled into this idea, into this concept. And that's another good point, is that really the name devil is a title. It's a placeholder. It's an archetype. And all of these different beings fall under that. And so it's sort of like, it's like kind of how I conceptualize the genus loci and the land wights, whereas like the genus loci is the overall being, it's the overall spirit, and the land wights are like the individual cells that make it up. And that's how I feel about the devil. And I think this is like sort of my soft polytheism showing. But I think all of these sort of spirits and beings are the individual cells of this greater whole. And as a traditional witch, the title that is very fitting to put over that whole is the devil.
Yeah. There are so many good comments in the comment section. Beanbag Hagweg says, growing up Catholic, I was taught to fear the devil. I found that life is full of way scarier things than the devil. Timothy says, I've really had a coming home when it comes to my understanding of the devil and what that means to me. It's definitely been enlightening to do research on this. Timothy also says, I fought against it in many ways because of prior conditioning, but I made a point to break free of that. Hellbound says, old horny. And that fetches are fascinating.
They are fascinating.
Dancing with spirits under a full moon, count me in. Taya says devil equals horned god, ?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes. I mean, it's interesting because even when you look into sort of early initiatory Wicca, you see the title devil pops up, not always sort of in connection with concept of deity, but even if you read some of the like available public liturgy from early initiatory Wicca, the way they describe the horned god or the god really feels more akin to this sort of devilish character than, sort of the pagan Jesus that, we see in kind of a lot of more modern depictions, I guess. Again, I know that sounds disparaging, and maybe it is in a little bit, but this sort of like depiction of like, he's just this kind of like long-haired, peaceful, horned dude who like is really sexy.
Always super sexy. Like,
yeah, which I don't like that, to be honest. It's not my version of sexy, so I'll just put that out there. The like super ripped horned god, like that just doesn't do it for me.
Well, I think that they mix a lot of like satyr-like depictions, which are multiple different aspects of horned. I think they mix that with kind of this horned god depiction at the same time. And I think that's where like this very phallic, very like hyper, because also too, like we're looking at this like, okay, this triple moon goddess who is summed up by her cycles, and then this horned god who like it's like very binary. Yeah. It's very binary. It's very like men, women, like male, female, feminine, masculine, like,
which is actually like something that I think is really important to note, is just the way that the devil is also in a lot of ways very non-binary.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this in folklore where the devil easily shifts into the form of a woman, will shift into the form of an animal. I mean, the devil's just all things. Um, and so I think that, yes, there's sort of the like common tendency that like the devil is masculine or masculine presenting. There's also these other shades that come in various stories, and I think that hints at this sort of overall way that the devil is sort of undefinable. Like, and I find this with a lot of spirits. Like, you try to sort of pigeonhole them, and you're like, okay, I think I have this sort of figured out, and they're like, just kidding. I'm gonna be whatever I want to be. So good luck trying to figure that out.
Yeah, and reading your book, like my, because like I would say I've been interested in witchcraft probably since about the time I was in high school. And like there are some things that growing up that my family would do that they would never call witchcraft, like using astrology to plan a wedding. Like they would never call that witchcraft. You know what I mean? Like that's just something that's just done. You know what I mean? Or I also personally view like prayer very much as like a type of witchcraft. And like even though I don't consider myself Abrahamic now, like I still pray. Like I still find meaning in that for me. Ramadan is coming up in April. We'll see. I'm not very good at it, but like I do try to make a conscious effort, because that's still something that, you know, I think is a sacred thing. But reading your book really kind of put the devil more so into perspective, because I would say, you know, I started really seriously getting involved in my local community, not necessarily practicing witchcraft, but getting involved in my local community around 2016. And most of the groups at this time, which this is also, we had Witchvox, okay?
Yep.
Um, most of the groups at this time were eclectic Wiccans, Gardnerian groups, and some Druidic groves. Like, if you wanted to work with community, like that was kind of what was there. So I kind of
Mhm.
like delved more into Wicca, which is just kind of what I felt like I needed to do, you know? And then I learned through that that like some of this is good for me, but like a lot of this is really not actually for me, you know? Um, and I've always, and I don't know if this is like a trans T or what, but I've always just never really connected very well to the divine masculine. Like it's always been like a weird relationship. But when we're looking at like the god of the wild or like that sort of aspect, I've always connected to that. Like I've never had a hard time connecting to like the green man, if you will, or more of like a liminal divine masculine. But when there's been like specific masculine deities, I've never really felt really honestly any interest at all, which then like some Wiccans are like, well, you know, like you like, and it just wasn't a tea. But I also like definitely didn't want to go sit with the Dianics either. And some of them didn't want me to sit with them. So it goes both ways.
Right. You
Like,
are spilling tea.
oh, that's what we do over here. We do that over here. We do that over here. Um, but yeah, so I think to me, and then I had that experience that I talked about in that video, which is so crazy because I remember reaching out to like some of like my coven mates, and I remember reaching out to like some people who I consider to be kind of like mentors or elders to me in my local community, and being like, okay, what the fuck was this thing in my dream? Because like I know there's a difference between like astral traveling, having a prophetic dream, but also too just having your subconscious mind, you know, release things out. Like, and
Sure.
this was very different, very, very different. And it was very, very intense. Like I woke up in sweats. I was sweating. And like at that time, it was like, okay, I don't really know what this thing is. But then like
Right.
reading your book, and then I looked at a lot of like these depictions of like the witch father, if you will, and it was like almost verbatim to what I had seen. And so that was really like wild to me that like I've never seen this in a book. I've never read the scripture. You know what I mean? And it's in my dream. Like, it was a crazy experience. Yeah. Finger wagging witches are annoying for sure. Um, James Jones says that we can find devilish characters in all of history, all over the world. That's why I believe so much as with the goddess. You see them in all cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's sort of these sort of devilish characters. I think this gets us into a tricky place where we just have to be careful about how we're maybe labeling things, especially things from specific cultures. There's been this sort of, I don't know if I would really say it's a trend, but some writings that have been done about this idea of like an American folkloric devil, who they equate to a specific native spirit. And I think that gets us into problematic territory where now we're labeling the spirit from a specific cultural group as a devil and incorporating that into our witchcraft. And I think that's not appropriate.
Yeah, and I think it can be tricky, especially when one, we're living on stolen land, like to begin with. So like I don't necessarily let me say this too, because people on YouTube are crazy. At this time, I do not use the word traditional witch as a label for myself. There's a lot of things in Kelden's book that really resonated with me. Like I thought it was crazy, like treading the mill. Like I had no language of that at all. But my coven, we've been doing that in the coven for probably like the past 4 years. None of these people have read this book. None of these people are familiar with folkloric witchcraft. That's like really wild to me that like we've been treading the mill, not with that language, but that concept. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Or kind of like laying the compass. Like that was also, it was moments like that for me reading the book that I was like, wow, like to me, this is like a very spiritual thing and a correlation in the sense that like, I don't have this language. I didn't know that I didn't, put these words together, but yet we've been doing this for several years now. And like, I think that speaks to the overall current of witchcraft in America. But I also do think when I was reading your book, I was like, how does someone who's not native to the land connect with the land in a way that is respectful, and like really contemplating like on my respect for the land as someone who is not native to this land. Like, and it's something that I feel like trying to understand.
Right. I think for me, it's really about like, I think obviously our land is infused with otherworldly spirits, and spirits of the midworld and the hidden landscape here, sort of the physical plane. And I focused in on those spirits rather than maybe specific sort of, specific spirits that come from the folklore of different tribes. I don't focus in on those because it doesn't feel appropriate for me to do so. I'd rather work with sort of the broader realm of spirits, as well as I think there's a lot of spirits that were also brought over. So like we see like a lot of like types of fair folk, for example, maybe from Scotland or Ireland. And I think that a lot of those spirits also came over when people came over.
I agree for sure. And like something I've had talked about with Australia, who's in the chat, who has been on my podcast and she has a channel as well, is all this like crazy, and I'm not even super familiar with it. She knows more about it than I do, but we have all this like werewolf lore in Indiana. Like,
wow.
That I think is like, I don't remember, French, German, I don't remember, something like that. Like, but I have a comment for you from Lynn Smith, and
Yes.
they say, I've heard some say that the genus loci.
People say it very differently. I say genus loci.
Okay, you gotta teach me because I just make words up. Like,
I don't know. I've heard people say, and I'm never here to shame people for how they pronounce things because I think there's not really a point in that.
well, so the genus loci equates the devil or horned god. If you could touch on that, maybe I personally recognize the genus loci much more as an overall spirit of a place, as you had described.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't necessarily see the genus loci as a facet of the devil. What I see is a facet of the devil being like Justin, like what you were saying, like this sort of wild god, this green man. Um, I think that there's this verdant aspect of the devil who is very much kind of a shaper of the land, the spirit that roams through the forest. So I see that as being a very potent guise of the devil, but I would say that I still see that as separate from the overall spirit of place. Um, I don't see those things as necessarily. I mean, I would see those things connected in the sense that I see us as all connected. That I think we're all, um, we're all a part of each other in some way, but we're also still our own distinct entities.
Um, I was also just thinking in terms of the devil. When I got to the point in the book where the devil's bread or
Mhm.
the housel bread, right?
Mhm.
I literally stopped what I was doing when I was reading the book and I got up and I went and made that bread and like with some strawberry preserves. Chef's
Yeah.
kiss. Chef's kiss. Yeah, I had everything to make it. And so I was like, I'm making this. Like, it's 9 p.m. on like a school night, but like, I have to make this devil's bread. Like, you know, it
Mhm.
was very good.
It's
I
a
highly
really
recommend
easy recipe.
it is, and it's really good. Like, I
Mhm.
expected it to be like very autumnally tasting with some of the stuff that's in it, but
Mhm.
and also I measured with my heart. Okay. But it was like there, but it was like not as strong as I thought it would be. And I'm not even really like that big of a baker. Like people who know me personally know that like Jasmine doesn't bake because I don't measure
Oh, I love
anything.
baking.
Like I'm good with cooking because that's like
Mhm.
I feel like that's way more intuitive and like add a pinch of
Mhm.
this, a dash of that. Baking, like if you mess something up, like shit's exploding. Like it's
Right. Mhm.
like um so yeah. And then we also have like the concept too of like, the chthonic lord of the mound.
Yep.
And like when you
Mhm.
talked about that in the book, that really spoke to me a lot too, because like it was very reminiscent to me of like the oak and holly sort of teas from like when
Mhm.
I was circling with some Wiccans. And like that is something that like is still a part of my practice, even though I don't identify as Wiccan now.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of different aspects to the witch father or the devil. Um, and same with the witch mother. And obviously, these are not concepts that all traditional witches or folkloric witches work with. Um, and one thing that I do try to be more clear on, I don't think I was as clear about this in the Crooked Path as I could have been. It's like the one regret. Um, is that the
Oh,
witch mother and this is the
tea.
T. Is that the witch father and witch mother often aren't operating as this sort of like romantic sexual pair. They often are operating totally independent of one another.
So you mean to tell
Um,
me that like the god isn't perpetually having sex with his mother and like over and over and over again?
no, no, no. And I think part of what's confusing is that they do sometimes get paired together. Like I would say I work with the witch mother and witch father. Um, and just the terminology father and mother together often, people put that together. I mean, that makes sense. I wouldn't say this is again the most like helpful terminology, but it's what we use. they're a father and mother because they're primordial beings in their own right. They're creators in their own right. They're not creators because they come together and they have this sexual union, and from that all things are created. They're creating things all on their own. And I would say that they do sort of operate on different levels, in the sense that the witch mother is really who is behind all things. She's the veiled lady. She's fate. She's spinning all of our destinies. Um, and so in that way, sometimes she's sort of this unknowable lady, this unknowable goddess, if you will. Although it's not to say you can't have a relationship with her or feel close to her, because you totally can. But I think in some ways too, that's why the witch father, or the devil, who's much more earthy, is worked with a lot more, because he's more of this intermediary, this more accessible, knowable being. But again, this all depends on who you are in your practice and who you work with. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that there's not just one answer. There's not just one way of looking at it. And even, again, when you think you have it all figured out, everything turns on its head and you're challenged all over again.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I would also say too, for anyone watching, if your practice isn't evolving and changing over time, then how much are you really practicing, and how much are you really reading, and how much are you really learning? Because I do think that like your personal practice should be evolving and growing with you as a practitioner. And like if anyone, is being weird or problematic or shamey about that, like that's just a bunch of armchair witches running their mouths. Like that's all that is. And like being finger wagging witches. Like, so yeah. I very much resonated with like how you kind of put the witch mother in my own practice. What I felt like I connected it to was just kind of like my overall relationship with like just what I consider to be like the dark goddess, period, not necessarily an individual. And I really also agree with the fact that to me the devil does feel much more earthly, and like the dark goddess to me feels much more like cosmic. And I do feel like, you know, working with the devil in a folkloric sense is just kind of more, to me, kind of grounded and just kind of more a tangible thing, because it's also connected to like where you physically are. Versus I kind of feel like the dark goddess is much more of like a spiritual, aethery kind of thing.
Yeah.
Cosmic.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people talking about different spirits: Hecate, Lucifer, Hulda, which Trish knows we have an affinity with Hulda.
I had no idea that you guys knew each other. Like, and then I think I saw a picture of you two on Facebook together, and I was like, hold on, the digital world just got a little bit smaller. The digital world just got a little bit smaller.
Yeah, so there's a lot of spirits and faces, and that can fall under under these headers of witch father, witch mother, devil, queen of the Sabbath. There's a lot of pretty juicy terms that we can use.
What do you feel like is like the biggest takeaway that you got from writing the book? How, if at all, has your practice changed since this book has been published?
I think just that it's the realization that like there's just so much, and seeing that again, like this sort of response from people, that there's a lot of people that have been doing these things again on this intuitive level. And that's very much how I felt when when I discovered, even when I discovered Wicca at a young age, but then especially when I found traditional witchcraft, it was this sort of like cycle back to childhood and realizing, that there's so much that I was doing as a child that now I have language for. Hedge crossing or spirit flight, these different spirits. There's names for all of these things. And so it was, that sort of classical coming home feeling.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's so many takeaways from writing this. And I think really the takeaways that I would hope, that people would take away from it is just a better understanding of what traditional witchcraft is, how this relates to sort of the broader tree, if you will, of witchcraft, right? Like how this relates to Wicca. I think there's a lot to be said about this like sort of tension or feud between Wicca and traditional witchcraft that's just so unnecessary and stupid. Um, and also that people would take away from like specific topics, like the importance of working with your actual landscape, or that it's okay to engage in baneful magic, if and when it feels justified, that's a thing that people do, and that's okay. And it's okay if you don't do that, but that there's more out there. There's a lot of aspects of witchcraft that don't get talked about, but it doesn't mean they don't exist, or that nobody's doing those things. Whether that's working with the devil, or traveling into the other world, or working with flying ointments. These are things that happen.
Well, we have to take a pre-K pause because Australia needs brownie points and cookies for recommending the book. Because she did turn me on to your book. So I will say a big thank you to that. So pre-K pause. And Hellbound Heathen says, my practice is better than yours. Sarcasm. Beanbag Hagwag. I don't label myself as a traditional witch, but I understand my own practice better after reading the book. Yeah, I really agree. And honestly, this is probably how I feel as well. Like one of my things about like the thing of traditional witchcraft, and I had talked about this to a few friends of mine who have also read the book, and one of my coven mates are reading it right now, is I kind of felt like I don't really like the name traditional witchcraft. Like I think folkloric witchcraft sounds so much better. Not like, who am I though? Like it doesn't matter. I'm just saying I feel
No,
like
but I mean, I would agree.
traditional,
Yeah, I would agree with that.
like I feel like traditional kind of hints that like whose tradition?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Right. No, exactly. I mean, I right away in the book, I talk about like, you know, this is not a really helpful term.
No, and you've mentioned that on the
Specifically,
live too.
specifically because the word traditional tends to be very loaded. Um, and we sort of have to break down our preconceived notions about what it means to be traditional, which typically the preconceived notion is that this is very, very old, and that it's one specific tradition, and that tradition has not changed at all since the long ago times when it supposedly maybe began. And none of that is true, and none of that has to be true for something to be traditional. So, it was a few years ago, I know, like specifically through a few different works, but primarily Aaron Oberon, in his book Southern Cunning, he starts to talk a lot about this idea of folkloric witchcraft. And then we see this term sort of become more popular. And it's a great term. It's a great term. It's a lot more helpful. So, I mean, at this point, I'm sticking with the term traditional witchcraft because it's where I started. But, I do see these as two very similar. I mean, I view them as interchangeable. I know some people will make the sort of argument that, even still traditional witchcraft is more like ceremonial, versus like folkloric witchcraft is very like dirty, hands-on. I don't see it that way. I think I think it's all just traditional witchcraft. It's all just folkloric witchcraft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think like folkloric witchcraft, I like that because I feel like it's a lot more inclusive, because I feel like don't most traditions have some sort of folkloric aspect to them, like around the globe,
Mm-hmm.
I would say traditional witchcraft as a whole, not just like your book, but like material that I've been looking at about it. That's probably like my personal one thing about it. And I think when you had talked about like the whole rift between Wiccans and traditional witches being kind of silly, like I think people should just mind their business and practice their craft and like
Right.
focus on themselves and their own spirits. But I
Right.
do think that where a lot of like debate or weird feelings come in is when we start talking about things like gender and we start talking about things like ethics and magic and like the baneful aspect of
Mhm.
that. Not that Wiccan groups are necessarily all this or all that, or traditional witches groups are all
Yeah.
this or all that. But like I think that those are the hot topics between these two types of
Mhm.
thought. So
Well,
and
and I think part of this like rift, too, is like on both sides, it's a misunderstanding and of what each group is really about. So like I see this when I'm sort of flitting between, the two camps, if you will. Like there's like a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes about traditional witches or folklore witches, and there's a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions about Wiccans. Um, and so when both sides are buying into these stereotypes, it creates a lot of misinformation and a lot of fighting. Um,
well, I think
so
that's in
like,
our very, I think that's in our human nature is like,
mhm,
I think us as Homo sapiens, we love the other. Like we love the us versus them. We love the competition. We love the rivalry. Like I think that's an innate part of us as like a species,
mhm.
you know?
Yeah, yeah, and I see a lot of people in the comments are pointing out, like Kelden Heathen point is mentioning the Witchcraft Research Association, and Taya's mentioning the '60s. And yes, this rift goes back to the very start of the modern witchcraft revival. So this has been ongoing, um, and I think it's just this ultimately it's this sort of misguided um, attempt to find authenticity. I think this is something that comes up a lot is looking, we want to feel authentic in what we're doing, but we forget that authenticity comes from within. It comes from practicing magic that gets results. Of if you are able to connect with your spirits and get things done, like then this is an authentic witchcraft practice. Um, but sometimes we get hung up in this like, oh, like my way is better than your way and your way's not authentic, and if I sort of lambast you and your practice, somehow that's going to make me feel better about mine. So I mean, this is an ongoing process, and I hope that and I think we have had a lot more really helpful, conducive conversations around this topic so that we can all sort of start to get to this place where we realize that, what it truly means to be an authentic witch.
Murphy would like to know, they said, hey, I'm sorry I'm late to the party, but where can one purchase the book? What would be, do you have a preferred method for people to get the book for? Or
You can order it directly from the Llewellyn website. But I would always say, like, first and foremost, like, if you have a local bookstore, especially like a local metaphysical store, that would be like first choice. It is available on like all of the big box websites. Which like no shame. Like I'm not gonna shame somebody for ordering it from Amazon. I would say if you like want to leave a review, the best place to leave a review is on Amazon. But there's a lot of places. Llewellyn, otherwise local bookstores are great.
yeah, check that out. And like this book for me, it was a home run. It was a home run. Like, there is like that traditional witchcraft, folklore, witchcraft, whatever. But like I said, the whole book to me was really, really incredible. And I think that it's even for witches who might not necessarily even choose to identify as like a trad witch, I think that it's still a really good read. Um, because there was a lot of confirmation in the book for me about this is like, okay, like other witches are doing this too. And it was kind of a confirmation of being connected to this like wider current. And like the incense recipes, chef's kiss, chef's kiss.
Oh,
The
thank
witch
you.
mother incense, the witch mother incense in the book, really, really good. The bread, I've made that twice now. Twice I've made that bread. I think there was another question in here that I maybe missed. Hellbound Heathen says there are much mythology of deities that are both male and female, not so necessarily binary. Astradia says something people tend to forget is tradition doesn't necessarily mean old. Traditions can be new and evolve, but I feel a lot of witches don't think about tradition in that way. I completely agree. Like our coven's tradition is primarily mostly a neo tradition. And like that's a hot topic of like, you know, they're like, you know, oh my gosh, you guys are making it up as you go along. And it's like, God, I hope so. Fuck.
Right.
Like, I
That's
hope so. I hope
what
we
most
are.
of us have been doing. I mean, and that's like the other thing too that people forget when it comes to traditions, even like the you know like the really old ones. So like even if like hypothetically there is this ancient witchcraft tradition that would have been new at some point. Traditions aren't created in vacuums. Um, they're
Yeah.
growing and evolving and growing out of old traditions and changing as they pass from place to place or hand to hand. Um, there's not this like one pure tradition of witchcraft that's encased in amber and we must all do exactly that because like it's just not real. That's not reality.
Yeah, I agree. I think that like, for me, I think that like tradition is important, but also like how is tradition serving you and your
Hmm.
practice? Like, because one thing I think of is like early on, especially when I was identifying more as Wiccan, like right, like the book was like, okay, so your altar needs to be like this, and you need to have like a divine masculine side and a divine feminine side, and you need to have this tool and that tool, and this does this, and da 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 da. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do it just like this. And then I was like, oh, like later, like the more I started actually practicing, the more I started being like, why am I setting up my altar like this? Like
Hmm.
for me, this is not serving me.
Right.
Not that there's anything wrong with setting up an altar like that. It just wasn't serving me. Um,
Mhm.
Beanbag Hagwag says tradition to me means family and heritage.
Mhm.
Astradia says, Kelden, thank you so much for all the work that you've done and put out. You've certainly made an impact on my craft. I'm a co-sign on that too. Um, Taya says, witchcraft traditions are like Jello salads. They have to evolve to survive. Jello salads? That sounds like cursed.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't know, girl. Like, I'm like, I don't.
Do y'all do that up
I
there in Canada? Is
like.
Jello salad a Canadian thing? Like, send
I
me a
get what you're
recipe.
saying.
Send me a
I get what you're
recipe.
saying, but there's this part of me that read that and was like, wait, like Jello salad? Like, you mean it shouldn't exist?
Send me. I need a Jello salad recipe. Um, Yeah. Oh, so okay, we have like 7 more minutes because I try to keep these streams at about an hour. That's
Mhm.
what StreamYard prefers too. Um, I don't know Jello salad, Australia. I don't. I'm a transplant. You got to remember that. Like I'm not. It's not in the blood, honey. Um, so you had mentioned earlier about like some stereotypes that
Mhm.
you feel are placed on trad witches. What would some of
Mhm.
those be, and like how do you like
Oh my
what
gosh.
if you don't mind, because we love the
Yeah.
tea. We love the
I
tea.
actually I have a really old blog post where I talk about some of these stereotypes. But yeah, like I would say like primary stereotype is that a traditional witch is someone who is just trying really hard to be ooky spooky. They're trying to be an edgelord. Um,
But those are all
really,
my friends. All my
but
friends
really
are
all
edge
they're
lords.
doing is just a ripoff of Wicca. Um, that they, they're just obsessed with like blood and skulls and stuff like that. Basically, like the stereotype, yeah, it's just somebody who's trying really hard to be edgy and to be sort of a dick to Wicca, and that their practice is largely just a ripoff of Wicca. So, and the thing is like, okay, like true tea, like the tea of the tea is that, like, yes, there are people that are like that. But, and again, it's sort of like, sometimes it's like the loudest voices are not always the representation of like the whole. And I would say that's very true with Wicca too, is that a lot of the people, right, like we sort of think of like, like the stereotype of like of a Wiccan, where, right, it's like somebody who's like, oh, like harm none, like the law of three, like love and light, like crystals, blah blah blah, like yeah, like there are people that are like that, but they do not represent the whole. Like that does not represent all of Wicca. It's so much more nuanced and rich. So we have to like stop engaging with like this idea that like this caricature is representative of all those people on both sides. Um, and to like to sort of something that I find sometimes is that like people maybe don't always take me seriously as like a traditional witch because I don't act or look a certain way. Like I'm not like super somber and I'm not wearing my wide brimmed black hats.
But this is what witches look like. Like witches look like me and you. Like we look
right.
like witches because we are witches. Like
right. And again, I think we mistake that. And I think that's, again, goes sort of back to that authenticity piece, is like we look for it in externals when we should be looking within. So if we're looking at something like, oh, well, they don't dress like a witch, like, well, what do witches dress like?
Yeah. Yeah, I've gotten that plenty of times before too, where because I teach classes at the store, and so like, people coming for like a tarot class or something, and like they're very used to white women over the age of 50 wearing peasant skirts teaching a psychic development class, right? And then they come and like they see all of this, you know what I mean? And they're just like, but it's all good vibes.
Right. I mean, and again, that's like the thing. It's like, because this also now opens the conversation to like, the ongoing conversation about aesthetics. And like, I mean, if you want to wear those things, whether it's a wide brimmed hat or a peasant skirt, like power to you. Like that's great.
Yeah, I love peasant skirts. And I also have a bunch of like very kitschy, like capitalistic witchy aesthetic stuff. I have a pentacle skirt from Hot Topic hanging in my closet right now. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, of course I
like
do.
it's all good. It's just as long as we don't lose perspective of like, again, the variance of how people live their lives.
Period. And that's on tea.
That's on tea.
So, well, thank you so much for coming on. Like, and
thanks for having me.
Yeah, and like this has been fun, and like I feel like, if you'd be open to it in the future, I'm sure we could talk about more, because we've almost filled up this entire hour, and we have to wrap this up before that hits the 60 mark. So like now, when I hit end, we'll still be connected. So, but yeah, thank you everyone for joining. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to the chat completely. I appreciate, all of you guys asking questions, and there was a lot of really good conversations going on in the chat. Please check out Kelden's book, The Crooked Path. It's a really good read. You will not regret it. It has the Jasmine stamp of approval. And yeah, and thank you again, Kelden, for coming on. And yeah, maybe we'll have a part 2 or something. We'll have to talk off air.
Yes.
So thank you all so much.
Bye.